Good afternoon, everyone. This is David Skok, the founder and CEO of The Logic. I am just waiting for you all to join on to this. It's going to take a few minutes for everybody to come on board, so we'll stand by. But in the meantime, I just want to welcome you for taking the time. Today marks our second year birthday as a publication. We launched on June 11th today. June 12th was when we launched at 6 in the morning. And we're here now 2 years later, a going concern, which is something that I'm very proud of with the team that we have. And of course, in this climate that we're continuing to make a go of it is a great thing. And that's obviously because of all of you who support and subscribe to our journalism. We did open this up to some of you who are not subscribers, and I hope that you'll get a taste of what you're missing in this conversation where we are joined by Ben Smith, the media columnist for the New York Times. Ben took over the media equation column, which had been dormant since the passing of David Carr. And you'll know Ben from his time both at chief of Buzzfeed News, editor-in-chief of Buzzfeed News for 8 years, and before that, Politico, New York Daily News, New York Observer, and the New York Sun. I hope we can have a fun conversation about all the things happening in the world of journalism right now, both positive and some negative things. And with that, I want to welcome Ben to the call. Ben, are you there?
Thank you thanks for having me on.
Great. Okay, so we got a lot to talk about in 30 minutes. Before we get into all the stuff that's happening at the New York Times, which I think is worth discussing on a broader sense, I'm curious, you were editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News, and then you made the move over to the Times as a media critic. I could not think of a more masochistic thing to do to yourself than walk into a role like that. What was it that appealed to you about taking this challenge on?
I've always loved reporting, and I think I guess I was sort of ready to spend some time reporting, and this is an incredible kind of perch from which to do it. A very weird one because the Times is so central to this media story itself right now. But, sort of a moment in my life when I was kind of ready to do that. And it's interesting to come in as a reporter and have the people you're reporting on be people who were sort of your peers, as opposed to like when I started out having them be just sort of like, old people who disdain you. The more normal reporting situation.
Your first column was on March 1st. The lockdown started on March 12th, so you didn't exactly get much time in the newsroom. How have you adapted to report? I mean, and then add on that, first of all, adjusting to a new newsroom, but then reporting on the people that are in this newsroom. How are you balancing that odd place?
I don't really feel like an insider, and in fact, there is no newsroom, and so I guess I'm trying to not be too compromised by it. I mean, the Times is a great story. The tricky thing sort of operationally is that I have access to lots of Slacks and in meetings or in Zoom calls, and I'm trying to basically operate on the rule that if I see something in the course of my work, if a colleague tells me something, because they're the person, virtually sitting next to me, I can't use that, but I can call someone and say, hey, what's the union doing? What happened in this Slack that I'm not in? And use that. So it's tricky. And then, if you do an internal conference call with 4,000 people,
right,
and they're all journalists, that's not private. And I guess I would say, or that it's hard to presume that's private. And I would say more broadly, I don't really have any sympathy for reporters who complain about leaks.
Why is that?
I mean, we live on leaks, right? Like we spend our days trying to get people to tell us things that are happening that are true that they aren't supposed to tell. And so I find it kind of ridiculous when reporters complain about that someone in their own organization might be doing such a horrible thing.
I've actually wondered about the Zoom world that we're living in. We've gotten a couple of stories from people recording those meetings. If anything, I think leaks could be more prevalent in the next couple of months as the stuff becomes easier to access. I don't know if you're finding the same thing, but it seems it's a much easier thing.
I just had somebody send me a screen recording of a pretty awkward moment on a Zoom call at a big media company. And I do think, everyone is at home and bored and pissed off. And yes, when the reporter calls you to ask what's going on, there's no worry that your boss who's sitting, 2 desks down is going to overhear it. So it's great. It's great times for leaks, as you may have noticed.
So let's go back to your first column. Your very first column, you wrote about the Times itself. I know that I actually may have disagreed with your column in some ways, but you wrote in that column that the Times overshadows so much of the industry, the cultural and ideological battles that used to break out between news organizations, like whether to say President Trump lied, now play out inside the Times. Is there a paragraph with more premonition than that one written in the last decade? I don't even know, but tell us from your vantage point the James Bennett situation. You wrote about it earlier this week and used Wes Lowry and the context of race. But I am curious, just, you've had a few days now for the dust to settle. Any big takeaways or things that have surprised you through that experience?
Oh man, I would not say the dust has settled. It's like, January 1792. The I mean, there are, it's sort of a cliche that if you ask a journalist, like, why did something happen? They'll be like, well, here's the one reason. And if you ask a historian, they'll say, well, there were 19 factors. And I do think that, what happened at the Times last week, there's a lot of different things going on. One is how hard it is to do opinion on the internet and how tenuous that is. It used to be that you were a Metro newspaper and sort of as a service to your audience who probably weren't subscribers to the National Review and The Nation. You provided a platform where they could see competing political views and arguments that otherwise they would have no access to on your op-ed page. That is now ridiculous. That makes no sense. Like, there was a real logic to an op-ed page then. Now it is not hard to find competing political arguments on the internet. And so I don't think there was ever at these papers a real kind of reconceptualization of what is the op-ed page and what is an unsigned editorial. Like, is there anything more boring and useless than an unsigned editorial? And so I think you had these kind of these questions around what is opinion journalism that had been floating around and that James had been experimenting in a lot of directions with. There's a lot of stuff in the opinion section of the Times now that is indistinguishable from what I do. I think what I do is called news analysis and what they do is called reported opinion, but I can't really tell any difference. And so, I think there were some big questions about what is this thing supposed to be, that then when they did a fairly traditional function of opinion, which was to publish a kind of hacky politician's op-ed on a controversial topic, they didn't really have a clear way to explain what they were doing, because I think it isn't clear what they're doing to themselves or to the paper. And so that is one of the things that was going on. Another is that it's this moment, these media organizations are part of society, and it's a moment when society is very divided and energized around, in particular, the killing of George Floyd and what this attack on the protests around the killing became, was galvanizing for people inside, particularly Black people inside the Times, although certainly not only. In a way, that you see things blowing up at organizations and, Facebook groups and everything else all over the world right now. So those are two of the things that were going on.
Just because it's Thursday now, James announced he was leaving on Sunday. Is there still a lot of chatter within the room, at least in the room Slack channels? Or are people feeling, okay, we can move on now, we need to move on?
No, there's a lot of chatter.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot. I think everybody is, on one hand, tired and wants to move on. On the other hand, locked in their studio apartments in Brooklyn with a lot of time on their hands. So,
I've wondered about, you talk about the opinion section. I also think as a platform, it's evolved. It used to be you had to get through 20, 25 pages of the A section to get to the opinion section. So you had the context wrapped around it, to your point. And then now in an internet age, everything's disaggregated. So you have no context around each column, and
right.
It has to live on its own, and sometimes to its detriment. When we started The Logic, I deliberately shunned the idea of having guest contributors and opinion, except for my own, which take it for better or worse, for that reason, which is it muddies it muddies what you're trying to build as a brand. And I assume, the New York Times, you're 150, 125, 150 years old. It's less of a concern. But I do think that the disaggregation of each atom of information is probably making it harder to have, things stand as a package. So I want to move on to a couple of columns that you've written. One in particular on Ronan Farrow. You talked about this, and you got criticized on Twitter, for better or worse, about calling what Ronan Farrow does a kind of resistance journalism. I'm wondering if you can just extrapolate on that a little bit and what you meant, and if the events over the last month have in any way shifted your views.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think it's whatever you call it. It's pretty obvious to anybody in this business that, and I would say this is particularly true of stories about Donald Trump, that media outlets can say and write things about Donald Trump and have a huge audience of, Democrats, liberals, progressives who are inclined to believe them and delighted to learn about the latest terrible thing he did. And you can get away with being pretty sloppy on that story and get a lot of attention. I mean, I think if you watched MSNBC at any point for the last 4 years, you'd have noticed that. And I think, in Farrow's reporting, which I wrote about at length in a bunch of contexts, one of the things that really struck me was an article alleging a conspiracy. It's a little complicated, but to cover up, alleged misdeeds in the Department of Treasury. And the story was just totally wrong at every level and powered by this sense that these guys must be up to no good. And I think that there's just I think it's true in a lot of other contexts, right? That journalists tend to make mistakes in the direction that, of playing to expectations and their own expectations. It's just that, Trump right now is the sun in the sky that so much journalism revolves around. And so I think there's a kind of specific category of error that gets made around about him. Which isn't to say he's not doing terrible things every day, which are being, exposed and reported on accurately by people who are being really careful, because that is most of what's going on.
I mean, the idea of being an unbiased or an impartial view from nowhere, to use a J. Rosen lexicon, do you prescribe to any particular view on that? Should journalists?
Yeah. I mean, I think my own view is that you should know who reporters are. Like, I'm even sure if you should or you shouldn't, but the reality of today's world is that you know who reporters are. You can Google them and see where they live and what they look like and where they went to school and all sorts of other stuff. And the idea of, if it was ever a good idea, which I'm not really sure it was, but who knows, of the idea that there should be this sort of single unitary kind of implicitly white male voice, doesn't make any sense and isn't really tenable, even if it did make sense. But I don't really see how that connects in any way to whether you should get your facts right.
Okay, I want to shift gears back to your time at BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed was BuzzFeed News that you started. What was the goal early on? And do you feel like when you look back at your time there, you achieved what you'd hoped to achieve?
I'm not sure about the goal. The way that we thought about it was really like we're building a media company. My boss, Jonah Peretti, the founder, thought about it was that he's building a media company for an era in which the sort of core way that media gets distributed is going to be social. This is 2011, and he was really seeing around corners here, but, people are going to open their desktop computers and they're going to go to facebook.com and pinterest.com, it didn't even exist yet, twitter.com, stumbleupon.com, and the goal of media is to get into those streams rather than to bring you to their own destination. And BuzzFeed was a very kind of almost radical experiment like that. And I think when I came in was when he started realizing that news was one of the kinds of media that was going to spread that way. And my sort of own view was that the kinds of media that spread were original reporting and scoops, and where search engine optimization had favored aggregation and sort of repackaging other people's journalism in order to sort of optimize for Google. Social actually, among other things, favored really great original reporting that would cut through because it was new. And so that was sort of how I saw it. And I think, I think that basically has borne out, although obviously the economics are still very much in flux, and there's been the pendulum has swung back toward people's owned and operated platforms, although the social media is obviously not going away.
On the social side, I mean, I remember, I think it was a Facebook developer F8 conference in, I'm going to get my times wrong, but maybe it was 2015. Jonah standing alongside Facebook executives announcing that the video partnership between Buzzfeed and Facebook had put a lot of money towards that. And it seemed like for a period of time, though, well, still actually today, the social platforms would throw money at news organizations. And even when I was at the Boston Globe, there was this constant tension of do we take the money and shift our distribution strategy, or do we, stay the ground? And sometimes, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, negotiate with a hard line on the rev shares on these things. You guys, you really did dive in and were leading that pack. Is that a fair thing to say? And was there Jonah then came out a couple of years later and completely kind of almost had a reckoning on this. How do you view that period, and what warnings or things do you think you got from that in terms of how the platforms operate?
I mean, I think, BuzzFeed's DNA was woven into this explosion of social media. And so at some level, like, we can't, that was what BuzzFeed, that's what BuzzFeed is. And I think Jonah always assumed and saw coming, really, that the platforms would ultimately need quality content, would be competing with one another, and would be, in the way that cable operators did, would need to pay professional content producers to make that content in the sort of most abstract sense. I think there's now like a kind of, I think we all maybe underestimated the amount of leverage just a couple of giant players would have in that market. And there's a kind of a push and a pull now around that. But I think the fundamental thing that he was saying a decade ago that sounded totally insane at the time was that you'd have media companies with, like BuzzFeed, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, where most of that revenue was coming from the platforms, in the way that, MTV's revenue was coming from the cable companies, and that the distribution was going to be paying for content. I think that at least I underestimated the sort of quasi monopolies that Google and Facebook would become. But I also think there's still a tug of, that pendulum is swinging.
We see now, big campaigns for supporting local journalism from the platforms. And you wrote a column that touched on some of the ways that the platforms are ingratiating themselves with news organizations. Are you optimistic or cynical about the approach that Silicon Valley is taking towards journalism?
Cynically optimistic, I think. I think that Silicon Valley, that Google and Facebook really are starting to, in different ways, enter into financial arrangements with news organizations because they're afraid of regulation, and they're afraid of regulation because media companies led by News Corp are lobbying regulators. It's a very, like in any other industry, you'd be like, all right, like the coal suppliers and the coal buyers are each lobbying for different kinds of regulations. The mine companies want one kind of regulation, and the steel mills want another, for their own financial interests. And it's a pretty traditional industrial tug of war in some ways, playing out, least of all in the US, where media regulation is very light. Actually, Australia is the place where it's, I think, most interesting, where you have a very strong market regulator whose point of view is that, what would this market be like if there were 7 Googles? What would Google have to pay each news organization? Because they, each would need to have news in them, right? So they'd be bidding. And then how do we simulate that situation and force Google to pay? And I think, even in this crazy time, a lot of senior executives at Google and Facebook are spending a lot of time on conference calls between 6 p.m. and midnight with Australians right now, because it's a real threat to their business and a real change in how they're going to do business. Facebook has basically conceded that this is going to happen and started to build out a structure where they pay news organizations for inclusion in the news tab. Google is really resistant to it. I think the downside of it is that it's going to help. It's going to sort of drive consolidation. Like, to participate in these systems, it's going to be the Wall Street, it's going to be News Corp, it's going to be the Times, it's going to be the really big players who can kind of use their lobbying muscle against the platforms. And I'm not sure it actually winds up. I think it might actually wind up kind of driving more consolidation in the news business.
Yeah, we're seeing it in Canada too. By the way, there was a massive campaign by the publishers who've all got together, the traditional publishers, pushing or calling on the federal government here to tax big tech and then have those proceeds go towards newsrooms. I tend to agree with you. I think the people who will benefit from that, in essence, in another way, Facebook will be picking winners. And by the way, I should say on the funding side, yes, they're in the U.S. They're paying publishers to put their work on the news tab. That's in the U.S. You talk to them here, and they say, "Well, we're just experimenting with it in the U.S." So I'm not sure how quick they are or eager they are to distribute it or to roll that out around the world. But it does then lead to a second question, which is, okay, if you're going to force them to get involved here in Canada, at least, and maybe in Australia, it becomes a question of government intervention and government supporting or funding of newsrooms. Do you think newsrooms should be taking government funding?
I mean, they always have, right? Like, I mean, I think the idea that the news business has sort of existed independent of government support, at least in the United States, is a myth. Like, the postal service in the United States was in the I think late 1700s was rigged to favor newspaper publishers and give them free distribution. And there's legislation again all over the U.S. That requires the posting of legal notices, which has always been a major revenue stream for the news media, which isn't a direct subsidy, but effectively is. It's basically a tax on businesses that's directed to publishers. So, I mean, and it does it, and then there's also direct government advertising, which, in places like Mexico is used to control the media, and in places like community news in New York City, it comes pretty close. And so the media has always been in some ways corrupted by that, but it has also always been there. And so if you're saying, should we right now kick that leg of the stool out? And I would say probably not.
One of the things I find fascinating about this conversation is we still haven't really defined what we mean by local journalism. You often hear, well, platforms in particular support local journalism, but also, foundations, whether it's Knight Foundation or here in Canada, the McConnell Foundation, they all care about supporting local journalism. I think that the definition of what local journalism is, in my mind, has shifted. I mean, one of the things that I've learned through the 2 years that The Logic has been around is The Logic is a classic example of, some consider us a niche vertical, right? We are a tech innovation, tech publication. The flip side is we covered Sidewalk Labs, Alphabet Smart City project in downtown Toronto before any of the major publishers in newspaper publishers covered it, or before any of the local publishers covered it.
Yep.
And so, I wonder if there's a question that still has to be asked around the framing of what we even mean when we talk about local journalism.
Yeah, and I think there's a risk that a lot of the stuff that gets subsidized by, when you're talking about kind of non-market decisions, is corrupt or basically zombie publications that, print publications, and this is certainly true in the US, that a lot of the local media that survive are print publications that are sort of built to take advantage of weird loopholes around the printing of legal notices, but really don't do any journalism. Whereas it's very hard to build a business, and you have a lot of very small, scrappy startups doing great work and struggling to make money, that are purely digital, and a lot of the incentives are set up actually to sort of essentially to subsidize print rather than to subsidize journalism.
Ben, we don't have that much time left. I kind of want to go back to your Buzzfeed days and being the editor-in-chief of a newsroom. It's not people, I think, they think it's an easy job. And I'm usually not this friendly with interviewers, by the way, but I have a lot of empathy for people who have been in that chair, because I've been as close to it as you can possibly be. I wonder, when it comes to diversity, your time at Buzzfeed News, you reported your ASNI stats. You were very, ASNI, which is, for those that don't know, a newspaper association in the United States that collected regular statistics on diversity. Buzzfeed was disclosed that, and you had really, relative to others, good, to sound crass, metrics. But in light of everything going on right now, I'm wondering if you've been thinking about or reflecting on your time there, and whether, even now at the New York Times, whether newsrooms are well, let me ask it bluntly: are newsrooms racist?
I mean, I think that's. I guess I'd want a more specific version of that question. I'm not sure. Are there racists in newsrooms? Are newsrooms making terrible decisions? Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do think it's really important that when you're at the highest level making decisions about what you publish, you have a diverse group of people doing it. I mean, I think that's, and that doesn't all, that's not always I mean, I was, I guess, proud of that we were a more diverse newsroom than some, although I think we could have done better in a lot of ways. But I also do think, you have to have people at a lot of different levels, people making decisions coming from different places. I mean, in the US, it's important to have Black people in those rooms specifically. And I guess I think, I mean, so I think that's important. I think that one thing that people tend to, that you'll see, if you're going to have a more diverse group of people, you're going to have more arguments. You're going to have more disagreements. You're going to probably disagree. You'll have, I think there's this illusion that, if you have the diversity, I mean, there's an old expectation in American newsrooms, essentially, that you hire Black journalists on this kind of tacit bargain that they don't talk about racism, or that they kind of bite their tongues about their view on race, which is probably different from a lot of their white colleagues. And I think, appropriately, that is breaking down right now. But that you're going to probably wind up with more internal arguments and conflict when you have a more diverse newsroom, and that's good. And if you can do it in good faith and with a sense of openness from everybody in the argument, it's really, really healthy. But I think there's sometimes this illusion that you're going to get, diversity without more diverse opinions internally, which seems crazy to me.
Yeah, and it's also, I think what was illuminating in your last column around Wes Lowry and Marty Barron, the editor of the Post, and Wes Lowry, who was a reporter at the Post at the time, and some of the disagreements around approach, is, people seem to, newsrooms are inherently hierarchical places, as much as we don't want them to be, because you want to have as much creative freedom as possible. At the end of the day, somebody has to decide what's on A1, or whatever the modern day equivalent of A1 is. And that person is ultimately responsible for what happens on A1. And so, I personally, I wrestle with how much is a natural predisposition to not wanting to hear different things, and how much of it is ultimately having to just make decisions in order to keep the production line moving, quite frankly.
I don't know. I mean, I think. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I mean, I think it's a tough time to be in management in any company, including a news company. Yeah. And I'm not gonna. I feel like the one thing I probably shouldn't do is speculatively second guess my bosses at the Times a month or two in.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So month or two in, as we wrap up here, what can we expect? What do you, I mean, I feel like you've written about a lot of the things, you've checked off a lot of those boxes. Are you still going to have a beat in 5 months?
Yeah, the whole thing's just melting down, right? And I'll have to go. At some point, you get tired of covering the rubble. I don't know. I mean, I think it's, there are these two kind of competing trends, and one is toward consolidation around the biggest players, and then the other is that there are a lot of small, interesting things happening that aren't about to, the Logic isn't about to replace the Wall Street Journal, but is an interesting, ambitious company that can punch above its weight because of these digital advantages that you get when you are native to the internet still, even if the business models are shaky. And I think, so the growth of small subscription businesses, which maybe ultimately become big ones, is really interesting and is really like changing the face of the industry and of the entertainment industry too, a little more than people realize.
Yeah, and if anything, the creative destruction coming from this period where advertising advertising has dropped for the most anywhere from 30 to 50% at newspaper publishers, that does create an opportunity for places like The Logic where we rely heavily on subscribers, and that has actually helped us buttress us through this odd time. And that's a great segue and a freebie for me to plug The Logic to those of you who are
You're
joining us
welcome.
for free on this one. We do rely on you, and one of the things that I should point out is one day in one of my darker, more boring moments, I went through a couple of publisher financial statements and try to get a sense of how much of a dollar of somebody's subscription goes towards the newsroom. One of the perks of being a small startup with low overhead is that while for regular publishers it's about 10 to 15% or 10 to 15 cents on the dollar goes towards a subscription, at a place like The Logic, it's upwards of 65 to 75 cents. And so you can know that your subscription goes directly towards supporting the work that you love to read. On that note, Ben, I'm grateful that you took the time. I know it's an insane week and an insane month and an insane time, and we're delighted to chat. And to everybody who joined in, delighted that you could join us as well, and we'll speak again soon.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you all.